Chapter 39, The Unknown. "All right, what's our next move?" Karnik demanded, surveying the three men ensconced in Parker's lavish office chairs. They exchanged uncertain glances, the weight of the situation evident in their hesitant expressions. As Karnik's restless footsteps marched across the room, he mentally sifted through potential strategies, but all seemed to lead to dead ends. Finally, his patience snapped. "Someone better start talking," he exclaimed. "Okay, what do we know?" Karnik asked. He looked over at the others. "We know martial law has been declared in Missouri, but aren't sure how far it stretches. We know United Nations soldiers are blocking the roads. By all accounts, the governor has run off. And we have over 400 men." Karnik stopped in his passing to address those in front of him. "We also have an inside man." After opening the door to the office, Karnik signaled for one of the guards posted outside to come over. "Locate Robert and bring him here." "Go," Karnik said. Off the soldier ran. "They are also planning on removing all personal firearms from individuals, Sergeant," the lieutenant governor added to the list. From the expressions on their faces, the lieutenant governor realized that they must not have known. "Who is going to? The governor?" Sawyer asked, straightening up in his seat. "They are planning on using the UN troops along with those from our military they feel would do so. When I protested against the idea, well, you saw where I was." They could feel sorrow in his voice for not being able to stop the day's events. "Yeah, that follows the intel I received. Okay then, Governor. We need to get your voice heard. If we don't have the people behind us—" Karnik looked around the room. He continued calmly. "We all die here." There was a knock on the door, and everyone focused on the person on the other side. "Enter," Karnik called out. Karnik got right to the point. "Robert, we need intel from your buddy." Without asking why, Robert pulled the phone from his pocket and dialed. After 2 rings, he hung up. "It may be just a minute," he informed the group. "Anything particular you would like to know?" "Yes, anything about our actions here and whatever other information he can relay," Karnik said. His theory was, keep it simple. Ring, ring, ring. A few minutes passed. Robert spoke with Sam while the other men watched and waited. Each man grew impatient as the conversation carried on. "Okay, stay safe, Sam." It was time. The one thing every successful operation needed is information. "What does Sam have for us, Robert?" Karnik asked impatiently. "It looks as if the governor here is correct. They have set up firearms check-in stations all around the states. UN troops are spearheading the operation and going door to door with a list of potential gun owners. A great deal of people are resisting, and there are a number of skirmishes taking place." "Good God," the governor said. "I told them that would happen. What about our actions? Any word on what they are sending our way?" Karnik asked. He was more interested in this than the other information provided so far. "Nothing." "Nothing?" Karnik asked, not believing Robert's answer to his question. "That's right, Karnik. From what Sam told me, nothing has come over the wire. He feels as if it is being kept hushed up. He did say that the governor is supposed to speak today in St. Louis. So they are planning on just containing us here." While in deep thought, Karnik raised his right hand and rubbed the stubble on his chin. Sawyer recognized the look on Karnik's face and knew that Karnik was putting together a plan, one that Sawyer knew he was certainly to be happy with. "Colonel, you know the community. Can you get a news crew in here?" "Yes, I have someone I can call, but how do you plan on getting them to the armory?" Sawyer thought that Karnik had forgotten about the mass of UN soldiers blocking the way. "So they're going to take a train tracks, that is." Quickly understanding where Karnik was going with his plan, Parker began looking through his desk for the number he wanted. Locating the number, he began dialing, while Karnik explained the rest of his plan. "We have to get the word out about what is taking place, gentlemen. The only way they can gain total control is to do away with the Constitution, and that would require a civil war. After that, they could simply say it failed and write up a new constitution." Karnik felt as if he had put it all together. Now it was time to let the world know. "Governor, you and Commander Sawyer here will have to convince them," Karnik said, while giving Sawyer a pat on the shoulder as he spoke. Karnik knew that Sawyer hated being on camera. "While you two work on what you are going to say, I will let the front gate know to expect guests." Karnik looked over to the colonel for a thumbs up or thumbs down about the reporters. He received an encouraging sight, as the colonel's thumb went high in the air and was followed by 20 minutes. With that, Karnik exited for the front gate. He took Robert with him. The UCM soldiers held their positions, eyes trained on the adversaries looming at the crest of the hill. Their greatest fear, a drone's silent presence overhead, a silent harbinger of the unseen threat of Hellfire missiles. Yet, in the face of this invisible menace, they remained steadfast in their shallow dugouts, every man committed to the cause he had sworn to protect. Karnik, displaying a boldness that belied the gravity of the situation, emerged from his Humvee. With each deliberate step, he daringly moved from one position to the next, seemingly challenging the enemy to take their shot. His audacity, rather than escalating fear, instilled a renewed vigor in his troops. Witnessing his fearless strides, they drew strength and felt a glimmer of hope, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. After relaying critical updates to each outpost, Karnik slowly made his way back to his Humvee, consumed by an overwhelming calm. Time, which often seemed to stretch during intense moments, now felt suffocating in its stagnancy. But this wasn't just any other mission. This standoff was on his homeland. Karnik's mind drifted, reflecting on stories of his great-grandfather's final stand. Not the tales of the sergeant who heroically guided his villagers out of war-torn area, but stories of his actual great-grandfather. He envisioned the bleak atmosphere, the raw courage of his grandfather, and a group of battered soldiers standing firm against odds, their spirits unwavering as they braced for what might come. The thought occurred to him, "Am I facing a similar destiny?" The sound of gunfire snapped Karnik back to reality. His first thought was that they were making their move and not waiting for others to come. Making his way over to the front of the Humvee, which put the motor between him and incoming fire, Karnik soon noticed that nobody was firing back, and no rounds were striking in their area. "Have they all gone crazy and started shooting at each other?" he mused while keeping an eye on the activity. Karnik could see men dropping atop the hill, yet his men weren't sending fire. He watched and waited. As he watched, the white UN vehicles flew to each side, reminding him of a rodeo when the opening shout released a big black bull. Only this bull was a large 4x4 speeding through, followed by many others. "Hold your fire! Hold your fire!" Karnik yelled out as he watched the scene play out in front of him. "Who is it?" Sergeant Smith called back from a nearby dugout. Talking as if Smith were next to him, Karnik said, "I have no clue." He counted 6 vehicles heading their way. Somebody was holding a white T-shirt out the window of one of the vehicles. "Friendlies coming in!" Smith hollered out to the men. Karnik stood watching and hoped it was true. The lead truck approached the gate, and as Karnik's men began returning fire at those remaining at the blockade, all hell broke loose. It didn't take long for the firing to end. Knowing that they were outgunned, the remaining UN personnel ducked behind what was left of their vehicles. The truck neared its intended position and slowed down. Looking over, Karnik could see that it had taken a great number of hits. "Angelique!" Not believing his eyes and reaching up to rub them clean, Karnik took another look. "We need a medic!" she screamed as loudly as she possibly could. Still not believing his eyes, Karnik pointed. "Main armory," he responded, and watched as the truck sped away. Everything in Karnik's body told him to go after her, but the soldier in him knew that the mission had to come first. Doing his best to clear Angelique from his mind and refocus on what he had to accomplish, Karnik remained. Minutes ticked by, each stretching longer than the last. Karnik's gaze alternated between his vigilant men, the obscured tracks ahead, and occasionally the looming armory behind. Just as he contemplated reaching out to the TOC, a distinct sound pierced the stillness. It wasn't the roar of impending thunder, but the unmistakable tremor produced by tires jolting over railroad tracks. Though the dense foliage veiled any sight of the source, the escalating sound left Karnik certain of its implication. "Cardinal, put on your game face. You are about to make the news." Karnik was not one to break radio etiquette, but he knew just how much Sawyer hated being on camera. Seconds later, a van appeared from the newly budding trees and blooming dogwoods. On its side, in bold lettering, were the words ANA News. Well, they have come to the right place, Karnik thought. "Smith, take first squad and check it out." Karnik said. He wasn't going to take any chances just because they had a van. Smith was as thorough as he could be without a database to match IDs. He went through each piece of equipment and gave their vehicle a good going over from top to bottom. To the news crew, it seemed a little over the top, and even more so by the time Smith had finished asking them a long series of questions. By the time it was over, Karnik was confident that every precaution that could have been taken had been. He signaled to Smith to let the news crew on through, and he kept a close eye on the UN soldiers on the hilltop. Though he felt it was unlikely they could be in any shape to fight after the beating they had taken. With the news crew back in their van and heading his way, Karnik quickly jumped in his Humvee. Pulling out onto the main drive just before them, he slowly drove them to the main armory, where the press conference was to be held. His mind didn't think as much about the news conference as much as it did about Angelique's surprise visit and those she had brought with her. Out of all the strange days Karnik had experienced, he ranked this one as number one. Pulling into the lower parking lot just in front of the main building, Karnik could see Robert perched high above, looking out over the compound. Karnik wondered just how many times Robert had put the crosshairs on him since his sister had returned. Nevertheless, Karnik felt that things were a great deal safer with Robert on overwatch. "This way, ma'am," Karnik called out to the reporter exiting the van as he stood alongside his Humvee. Carrying only a microphone, she had an easier time than her cameraman, who wrestled with the gear as he fought to keep up. "I'm Sandra Wheeler from Channel 3 News. Good to meet you, Sergeant First Class." The woman reached out her hand to Karnik, who was a little taken aback that she knew military rank. Reaching out and taking her hand, he had to ask, "Have you reported on the military much?" "Why, yes, I was embedded with the 101st in Afghanistan 4 years ago." "Well, this seems to have become just as dangerous of a place, ma'am. Let me show you the way." Letting go of her hand, Karnik gestured to where the door had once been. The cameraman was close behind them, and Karnik could see their shock when they took in what remained from the earlier battle. They looked from the blood-stained concrete on which they walked to the bullet-riddled facade of the main building of the armory. Walking along in disbelief, Sandra Wheeler and her cameraman didn't say a word, but once they were inside the entrance, that changed. "Oh God," Sandra said while surveying the carnage that lay before her. Dried blood and spent brass mixed with broken glass and shattered display cases covered most everything. How did all this happen today and nobody knew?" Sandra asked, letting out another gasp. "Your questions will be answered soon, ma'am," Karnik said. He didn't want to waste time going over everything now and again in a few minutes. Continuing down the hall, they walked by rooms filled with wounded individuals being cared for. Then Karnik heard her voice, "Angelique." As he looked into the room, he saw her holding the hand of a man as medics worked to save his life. Karnik wanted badly to go to her, but he kept walking as he guided the reporter to a safe area to answer her questions. Opening the door to the office, Karnik walked in first and introduced Sandra as she entered. "Gentlemen, this is Sandra Wheeler. Sandra—" Unable to finish, he simply stepped aside. "Lieutenant Governor, what are you doing here?" Sandra asked, snapping into reporter mode. Seeing that Sawyer and Parker had everything moving forward, Karnik caught Sawyer's attention and with a simple hand gesture let him know he would be back. Then Karnik was off, shutting the office door behind him and making his way back to where he had last seen Angelique. As his anticipation grew, the distance between them seemed greater than it had just minutes ago. Karnik made it to just outside the room where he had last seen Angelique and slowed down. Stepping around the corner and peering into the room, he saw that she was still there and that the medics weren't moving as frantically as before. Leaning in, Karnik spoke her name softly. "Angelique." Getting no response, he spoke just a little more loudly. "Angelique." As she turned and caught sight of him, Angelique's heart began thumping hard and fast in her chest. She didn't know if it was due to the feelings she felt for Karnik or due to the current events, which she blamed him for. Lowering Cameron's hand and tucking it gently by his side, she turned to exit the room. Stepping back from the door, Karnik took a deep breath as she approached. He wasn't sure just what he would say and thought that the best thing to do would be let her speak first. Not saying a word as she exited, Angelique looked around as if attempting a search for something. By going door to door, she found it, an empty room. Not caring what it once had been, Angelique walked in as if it were hers. Looking very confused, Karnik followed her in and stood just inside the door. Angelique kept her back to him as she finally spoke. "Shut the door." The beginning hadn't unfolded as Karnik envisioned, but it was progress nonetheless. Heeding her instructions, he ensured the door was locked. As he turned to face Angelique, he held on to the hope that they could have a constructive dialogue. An expectant hush fell between them, but Angelique's restless energy got the better of her. She suddenly whirled around to confront him, but mere words wouldn't suffice. Channeling her fury, she lunged forward, her clenched fist connecting squarely with Karnik's cheek. "What the hell was that for?" Karnik asked as he straightened up, not really moving much from the blow. "Don't try to play me, you know damned well what," Angelique shouted. Karnik suddenly realized why he had never married. "You brought this to my front door and dragged me in." Her anger couldn't only be heard, but also felt by those in the hall through the closed door. Angelique wasn't one for crying, but she still fought back tears. Karnik couldn't hold his silence any longer, and a long-forgotten side of him began to show. Reaching out with both hands to her, he placed them on either side of her face and said softly, "Ange, I wouldn't have done anything to put you in harm. My men and I needed a place we could control, and I knew the area well. That is all. I had no idea you would be there." Raising her head slowly and meeting his gaze, Angelique began to relax and regain her calm. Then she spoke. "They took my mother and father." Slight panic ran through Karnik's body. "Who did, Ange? Why?" "Jonathan, Homeland Security. They were looking for you." Angelique leaned forward and slid between his large arms as they closed in behind her. Resting her head upon his shoulder, she said nothing, only rested and focused on controlling her breathing. After a minute, Karnik felt it was time to learn more about what Angelique had been through, anything to take his mind off her warm breath on his neck. Gently turning to the side and separating from her embrace, Karnik reached out to a nearby chair. He spoke as he pulled it over for her to sit on. "Tell me about it, Ange." 5 minutes passed as she brought him up to speed, starting with how she had been out of coffee and had taken her morning run down to their camp in the hopes of having a cup with him. While she explained the events, Karnik wished 138th had been on just another training mission, partially because he could have enjoyed a cup of coffee with her, but mostly for the men he had lost would still be with them. "And that is when we came across the mayhem all along the highway. I figured it had to be you, and when we saw the roadblock, we knew we had the right place. Cameron was hit on the way in. I tried to stop the bleeding, but it has been a while since I was in the sandbox." Hearing Angelique say sandbox created many new questions Karnik wanted to know the answers to. Only those who had been deployed to the Middle East used that term. Had she been there? He thought. Rather than ask now, Karnik thought it best to save those questions for later. Instead, he focused on the now. "Yeah, I was wanting to know about them. Who are they?" Karnik asked. He suddenly felt her hand in his and wondered if it had been there the whole time. "They were at checkpoints set up by the United Nations looking for weapons. They didn't want to give them up, so we helped out." "The guy who saved you, what's his story?" "You're going to like him, Carl. Master Sergeant Todd Myers, retired. Well, forced to retire. Yeah, remind me to tell you the story later about those forced out of the military. For now, though, I have to get back. We are getting ready for a live news broadcast," Karnik informed her before forcing himself to leave her side.